All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a literal, historical, sociological, and cultural shockwave generated by a single figure, Jesus of Nazareth. Look, whether you approach this topic from a strictly secular, historical angle or a deeply theological one, there is absolutely no denying that this first-century Galilean carpenter permanently altered the trajectory of human history. We're going to look closely at the data, the historical records, and the fascinating sociological context of his time to understand exactly how that happened.
Here is how we're breaking things down today. First, the historical footprint. 2, life in Roman Judea. 3, subverting the social order. 4, trial and crucifixion. And finally, number 5, building Western civilization.
Starting us off with Section 1, the historical footprint.
It's always fascinating to take a highly recognizable, heavily theologized figure and ground them in gritty, verifiable historical reality. So it prompts the ultimate starting point for investigation today, right? Did this first-century Galilean carpenter actually walk the earth? Like, can we verify his existence without just leaning entirely on the New Testament Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Well, the answer from historians is a resounding yes.
We know this for sure because of ancient, non-Christian sources, writers who were actually downright hostile to the early Christian movement. First up, we have Tacitus. He was a Roman historian who detested Christians, yet he explicitly recorded that Christus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Then you have Josephus, an aristocratic Jewish historian, who corroborates that Jesus was a teacher sentenced by Pilate to die on the cross. We even have the Jewish Talmud mentioning Yeshu being hanged on the eve of the Passover. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that even the fiercest critics of the early movement firmly corroborate both his existence and his execution.
Moving right along to Section 2, life in Roman Judea. To really understand the sheer impact of his life, we have to look at the timeline. Born around 6 to 4 BC in Bethlehem, during the incredibly unstable final years of the Roman-appointed King Herod the Great, Jesus basically grew up in a political powder keg. By 12 AD, historical sources note him demonstrating this extraordinary understanding of the Torah in the Jerusalem temple. Then, around 27 AD, his public ministry kicks off, characterized by itinerant teaching and healing that completely disrupted the status quo. And finally, in 33 AD, his life culminates in crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Keep in mind, he was operating in a world defined by heavy Roman taxation, deep messianic expectations for a political deliverer, and fierce internal religious debates.
But what did daily life actually look like for the average person he was talking to? To understand everyday survival in agrarian Galilee, sociologists point to a system known as the patron-client relationship. Because resources were so severely limited, most people were living at a bare subsistence level, survival literally required these unequal vertical alliances. A wealthy urban patron controlled the land and the resources, and the peasant clients offered loyalty, honor, and their intense labor just to scrape by. It was a highly exploitative system that left the masses heavily indebted and deeply marginalized.
All right, Section 3, subverting the social order.
Now, Jesus didn't push back against this oppressive system with an armed rebellion. He used storytelling. But to grasp the absolute genius of how his parables turned the rigid social hierarchy upside down, you have to understand the defining cultural code of the first-century Mediterranean world, which was honor and shame. Every single public interaction was a high-stakes competition for social standing. You acquired honor through this dialectic of challenge and riposte. So, when religious lawyers publicly questioned Jesus, they weren't just innocently asking for information. No way. They were initiating an aggressive honor challenge, actively trying to publicly shame him. And Jesus routinely won these contests by firing back with parables that completely shocked his audience. Applying modern sociology completely changes the way we read these stories today. Let's take the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. Traditional theology usually views the landowner, who pays late-arriving workers the exact same as those who worked all day in the blazing sun, as a symbol of God's grace. But sociological scholars point out that if you read this through a first-century peasant's eyes, it transforms completely. To a starving day laborer, this landowner is just another member of the exploitative elite who is deliberately insulting and shaming the hardworking peasants in a vicious honor contest. Jesus was using this story as a radical social critique, exposing the deep contradictions of the agrarian economy of his day. And we see this exact same subversion in the famous story of the Good Samaritan. When we decode this parable in its historical context, the expected heroes, the elite priest and the Levite, they do absolutely nothing. But the hero of the story is a Samaritan trader. Now, to a first-century Jewish peasant audience, a Samaritan wasn't just a random stranger. They were an absolute cultural enemy, and traitors were widely despised. Yet Jesus elevates this literal enemy as the ultimate example of general reciprocity, giving without expecting anything in return. I mean, the guy risks his life and hands an innkeeper a blank check to save a stranger. Jesus was completely shattering their moral boundaries. Furthermore, Jesus routinely contrasted two major institutions, the temple and the household. The temple system in Jerusalem was deeply hierarchical, exclusivist, and intensely male-dominated. Jesus countered this by elevating the household, which was a space of inclusive, generalized reciprocity where women actually held informal power. Just look at his parables. He actively used female domestic roles, like a woman hiding leaven in flour, as symbols for the kingdom of God. In an intensely patriarchal society, where women were largely marginalized in the public sphere, Jesus was subtly but radically validating their worth and their labor. Which brings us to section 4, trial and crucifixion. Before examining his death, we really have to look at why he was executed in the first place. The sources show Jesus claimed divine authority. He was forgiving sins, reinterpreting the Torah, and accepting worship. To frame these radical claims objectively, the scholar C.S. Lewis proposed his famous philosophical trilemma. Lewis argued that, based on the historical texts, viewing Jesus merely as a great moral teacher is intellectually impossible. You essentially have three options. 1, he was a liar who deliberately deceived the masses. 2, he was a lunatic, a madman completely detached from reality, on the level of someone claiming to be a poached egg. Or 3, he is Lord, exactly the divine figure he claimed to be. For Lewis, there was simply no comfortable middle ground there. Because of these claims, he was brought before Pontius Pilate, and the historical record leaves zero doubt about his brutal execution. Crucifixion was a horrifyingly efficient Roman punishment reserved for political insurgents and the absolute worst criminals. Now, some critics over the centuries have proposed the swoon theory, suggesting he merely fainted on the cross. But historians are quick to note that literally no one survived a first-century Roman scourging and crucifixion. Furthermore, scholars point out that theories suggesting his disciples simply stole the body fail to explain one crucial fact. Those same disciples were entirely willing to be martyred for their belief. People don't willingly die for a fabricated lie, right? This leaves historians and theologians alike to grapple with the profound mystery of the empty tomb and the subsequent massive explosion of the early Christian church. Finally, let's look at section 5, building Western civilization. To really understand the macro-level shockwave of this single life, we need to look at this quote from the acclaimed modern historian Tom Holland. Holland spent years and years immersing himself in classical antiquity, studying the ancient Greeks and Romans. And during that time, he experienced this profound realization about the true origins of our modern human rights. He writes, "It took me a long time to realize my morals are not Greek or Roman, but thoroughly and proudly Christian." Holland came to that conclusion because the Greco-Roman world was fundamentally brutal. It was a culture that glorified the strong, practiced murderous eugenics, literally leaving unwanted infants out to die, and viewed extreme power and callousness as actual virtues. There was absolutely no concept that the poor or the weak had any inherent worth. But the teachings of Jesus introduced a revolutionary inversion of those values. Suddenly, the weak had intrinsic value. Every single human life was declared equal. Serving others became greater than ruling over them, and there was a newfound nobleness found in suffering. So whether you approach this history as a person of faith or simply as a secular observer, the societal values that most of us in the West take completely for granted today, things like equality, compassion for the marginalized, the inherent dignity of the individual, they are not the default settings of human history. They are introduced by this historical figure. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder today. As you look at the world around you, how many of your own daily moral assumptions are actually the direct product of this first-century Galilean carpenter? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating historical shockwave with me in this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.